Good evening. How are you?
Doing well, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay. That's good. Okay, so we're continuing a bit Yosef here. So we're going to do the Rashi here, which is on this Gemara. So Rashi explains shika, right, and dicha, these two words. So yesterday we had these words and we said that one is like grinding, more, and one is like pounding. So Rashi says, right, what's the difference between the two? It's like one is more than the other, more thorough. So shika is more than dicha. And then he says, after he mashes them with the weight, he puts them into utensils, and then they come out by themselves. Second automatic thing. That's mutar lechatchila, to do that allowed. And then he says, Lo igmor, I shouldn't finish. Asur le'anichan tachat kobdan. You're not allowed to put it under the weight in the odyom while it's still day, in order that it should end when it gets dark. So when it's lacking dicha, the pounding, nobody argues the asire that's forbidden. So the teinatan he gomeret, because when the weight finishes it, so it comes out everything was done on Shabbat. The Tosot now brings Tosot. The Tosot says Hikshu al perush zeh. They asked regarding this. They queried on this perush of Rashi. Katu delari. They said, according to the Nireh shigmur hainu shigmur b'yochal b'Shabbat. When it says they should finish, it means that he finishes and eats on Shabbat. V'lo damer le'mashkin shezavu she'isuram gezerah. Shasurim doesn't resemble the case of the liquids, right? That oozed out by themselves. They're forbidden. Why? Because it's a decree, Shema Yischot, that he may come to squeeze it out actively. So he says here, even squeezing it out actively doesn't exist. So there's no prohibition. They are right from the Torah. So he says, look above. So he can finish with his hands when it gets dark. lematnitin doesn't resemble the Mishnah. Tolo sharu Bet Hillel, because Bet Hillel doesn't allow ela teinat korah, just to put the beam on the weight on top. But to do it actively, no, not so. They don't allow that. Because here we're talking about where they're not lacking any pounding. Like we said, gonna see close by. Rash also, the Ran also explains like that. Like Tosfot, the data Rif, according to Rif, this language, Hashum be'aboser. So he says when you have garlic or unripe fruits, which are like unripe grapes, ve'amelilot sheriskan, and if he pounded them before the Shabbat comes in, Hai sheriskan kolel risuk bedicha. So he says that which we say riskan, it includes both types of grinding. So meaning what? It's going into a large extent of grinding there, right? Higher level. The gimel melachot yesh b'dvarim anidochim. So he says there's three labors regarding things which are pounded. Leotzi mehen mashkin, to remove the juice from it. Risuk v'ticha v'shlika. These three things, right? Matnitin mayre b'shelo asa b'hem miba'od yom. So Mishnah is talking about where he didn't do it before Shabbat. Ela risuk, just he did risuk, right, which is a lighter level. Shakora ve'agulim miba'od yom enam ela meraskim. This is because the beams and those round things, right, they only merasek, they only do a light job of grinding, pounding before Shabbat. Aval acha mayre sheriskan be'adayim. Here we're talking about he actually did it actively. Shapir ad shehem merusakim. He did it like thoroughly until it's totally right crushed, it's pounded. Okay, good. So they're only lacking shchika, which is like the last phase, which is like grinding, or the last. It's totally ground up. Katana Rabbi Ishmael says Rabbi Ishmael, Omer, he says, he can finish when he gets dark. He can do it even actively. We learn from there that Rabbi Ishmael, according to Rabbi Ishmael, even if it's lacking dicha, if he squeezes it out, he presses it, he's not going to be liable to a guilt offering, a sin offering, I'm sorry. Name Ita the Mechayev, that it would be true that he's liable to that Hatat, sin offering. So then Rabbi Ishmael shouldn't have allowed that when they're only lacking shchika, which is the highest level of grinding. So he should have agreed that he may come to do right in the case where they're lacking dicha, which is the pounding. And since he didn't decree, so you learn from there that even when it's lacking just dicha, pounding, also, which resembles right Mishnah, if he presses it with this actively, there's not going to be any prohibition of a sin offering. The Rav Magi also says this in Perek Gimel, Divrei Rambam, according to Rambam. Okay, V'dat Rabbeinu b'Perush Yigmor Masechet Imahen. So he says, according to the Tur, right, the opinion of the Tur, they should finish this tractate with them. Shekach Katav Siman Shin Kaf Aleph. That's what he writes in this chapter 321. Shumu Boser Umelilot. That if you have right these garlic and unripe grapes and so forth, Sheriskan me'erev Shabbat. He pounded them before Shabbat. If they're still lacking dicha, pounding, asur legemoro dichatan. You're not allowed to finish the pounding b'Shabbat on Shabbat. Ve'im en mechusarin ela shrika. But if they're just lacking grinding, mutar legemoro b'Shabbat. They're allowed to finish on Shabbat. Okay. But it says according to the explanation of the Mishnah, the Tuanin and Datan Shaveh Imahem. That they're not, their opinions are not equal. Because according to them, the Mishnah is talking about when it's lacking pounding. So it says, therefore, it's not allowed to do actively. But just by way of pressing it with the beam, they allowed it. Because they're already pounded, mashed, whatever. Because from the time that he put that beam there, on them, they already got pounded. So according to him, he says the Mishnah is talking about where he first pounded it, and then he pressed the beam on them. So there, by putting the weight of the beam, it's like dicha, like pounding. And it's allowed even to finish actively. But if they didn't, they were not pounded before the weight of the beam. So now they really weren't able to place the weight on it. Just to pound it. And they're still lacking dicha, pounding. Mashkin hayotzin asurin. So in that case like that, where the liquid is oozing out, it's going to be forbidden that liquid to use. Okay. Let's move on. So it says the Arif Paska the Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina, the Arif Paskin like this rabbi. כתב גם לדרבה בר בר חנא וכתב ארן, and he wrote also the opinion of this rabbi, and the Ran says sheikshuu alav, that they asked on him. The mashma b'gemara, because it implies in the Gemara the had Rabba bar bar Chana pliga the Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina. It implies there that these two opinions argue with each other, so they don't match up. So how did he pass like both of them? The Rif. So he says, he answers like this, right? That we can say that it's like Bar Chana, they're the same. In other words, these two rabbis, they're the same opinion. Why? Because according to this rabbi, when they're pounded, nidochim, and pureed, ve'enam mechusarim ela shechika. So they're only lacking grinding. Igmor be'adayim, so you can finish even actively. Rabbi Yishmael, according to Rabbi Yishmael. Minan Ishma. So we learn from there that kashem mechusarim dicha, when they're lacking pounding. Oshkika and grinding, since they're already pureed, like the way of the Mishnah, the sharu alidetina, they allow by way of putting the weights on them, the beams. This rabbi also says so. Divrei Rambam, the words of Rambam. Ve'arosh gam hu katav k'divrei Aryaf. He also wrote like the Riyaf, which is the Rif, same guy. That's coming to reconcile what they asked on the Rif. כתב, וצריך לומר שרבי יוסף בר חנינא סבר דמתניתין לא חשיב כמחוסרין דיחה. So we have to say, right, that this rabbi holds, the Mishnah is talking about where he doesn't consider them to be lacking pounding. The Sober Rabbeinu shedato lomar. So Rabbeinu, the Tur holds that he thinks to say like this: the matnitin keshenitraska kodem tzinat that this Mishnah before it got pounded is before, right, the weighing of the beams. Because by way of the weighing of the beams, it's like pounding. So it's allowed to do that even actively. He says you can finish it. But if they didn't get pounded up before the weighing, so then the liquid that oozes out is going to be forbidden. Even though they're coming out by themselves. This is what the rabbi says also. But the Mishnah, which requires that they should be pureed before the weighing, it's before the weighing. So that implies that it's not really considered to be pounded and pureed, unless the olives have been already like pressed, or the grapes were already treaded on. Dafka, only in that case. But he says if he doesn't really want to drink on Shabbat from those liquids that come out of it, so he says it hasn't been really hasn't really been clarified, right, from the words of Rabbeinu, the Tur, if it's allowed to put those beams on them in the Odom before Shabbat. So it says apparently it implies that it's allowed, even though they're not pureed. Because we quote a pasuk like Bet Hillel, because they don't hold that there's a prohibition of resting of your utensils. But according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, בחלק א', נראה שכל שלא נטחנו הזיתים ונדרכו הענבים, as long as the olives have not been ground, right, or the grapes have not been treaded on, אסור לטעון עליהם קורה. You're not allowed to press on them the beam before Shabbat. Because we're concerned he's going to squeeze it on Shabbat. He's going to press it on Shabbat. So we have to say, he says, the beteinat korah, according to him, right, that when it comes to the pressing of the beam, they're not really considered to be yet pureed. So if you would press them actively, Shabbat on Shabbat, he would be liable, right, for breaking Shabbat, sin offering. Therefore, he says we decree upon them. Maybe he may come to, right, to press it. But he says we already explained, right, that according to Rif and Rambam, this is allowed. So he says that's how we paskin. Okay, interesting. Let me just get a drink. 1 second, 1 minute break here. So, Okay, sorry about that. So let's continue. So it says about asur letet chitim letoch rechaim, right? And then we said you're not allowed to put the wheat inside the mill, right? We mentioned that yesterday, and we said the reason was because it's very noticeable, it's loud, it's noisy, so very conspicuous. So therefore, the rabbis decreed not to do that. So what does that mean? Don't start it and let it go by itself on Shabbat because of the noise. Okay, so says Bet Yosef on that, Gam zeh sham bebraita. It's also there in the Braita, Yud Chet Amud Aleph. We don't put the wheat inside the mill, Shemaim of the water mill. Only whatever can be done before Shabbat. My time, what's the reason? Because it makes noise, as we said, right? It's very noisy. Amar Rabbi Yosef. So that's where we learn, by the way, that you're not allowed to make noise on Shabbat. This is the source for that prohibition. So he goes on to say, Emma Yosef Mishum Shvilat Kelim. So the Lema Mor Mishum Shvilat Kelim. Why didn't it say because it's allowing the utensils to rest? El Amar Rabbi Yosef Mishum Shvilat Kelim. So Rabbi Yosef says, yeah, that's what it is. It's because of the rest. We conclude there, right, in the Gemara, that the Bet Hillel doesn't hold by the rest of the utensils, as we already mentioned. So according to this, right, to put wheat inside the mill, according to Rabbi Yosef, is going to be allowed. According to Rabbi, it's asur. It's forbidden. But he says that's only regarding the issue of a water mill. But if it's run by an animal, the animal's pulling it, so then for sure it's forbidden, according to everybody. Why is that? Because we do have to let the animals rest on Shabbat, right? That you do have to do. Okay, interesting. So then it goes on to say, Tatvot Tosfot Be'arosh, Sherabbenu Tam, says Tosfot and Rosh, the Rabbeinu Tam Pasak Rabbi Yosef, he passes like Rabbi Yosef, Vehem Dachut Berav. So they deflected his words. They lu de halacha kirabah. He said, no, halacha is like Rabbah. Vehem Pasak Rach, the Rach. Vehem Dat Samak, also Samak Vesamak. So all these rabbis said the same thing, same opinion. So they don't agree with Rabbeinu Tam. Okay. The Rip brought both opinions. Didn't pass him. The Rambam lo izkir din zeh klal. Oh, so he says the Rambam doesn't even mention this halacha. Umashma desfila de Rabbi Yosef. So apparently, right, it implies that he holds like Rabbi Yosef. The Shara that allows this. That's why he didn't bring it, because there's no prohibition. So he says, what's going to come out if we forbid? Any person is not really forbidden about his utensils to rest him. Like it says in Perek Vav, Halacha Tet Zayin, so he says the reason he didn't mention explicitly the reason is because it's not really written in the Talmud. It's not mentioned in Talmud explicitly. The Rabbi Yosef shared that according to Rabbi Yosef it's allowed. Then Darko lichtov elav mashe uzkar b'Talmud be'edia. Wow, look what it says, right? a good point. So he says that the way of the Rambam is that he doesn't mention things which are not mentioned in the Talmud. So it has to be explicitly mentioned in the Talmud. Otherwise, he doesn't bother with it. Rivash Katav b'tshuva, says the Rivash, Rach pasak kerabah, right? Rach paskins like Rabba. Afal gav the Rabbi Yosef pligi aleh, even though Rabbi Yosef argues with him. Ela sharif Rambam v'Rabbeinu Tam lo pasku ken, but these rabbis didn't pass in that way. The Arif Katav shte asarot, as we said, right? The Rif wrote both opinions. The halachot, in the halachot, the lo yichriya didn't paskin. Ad kaneshon, that's the end of it. The afal pi sharif the halachot lo yichriya. So it says even though the Rif didn't paskin in the halachot, if Sharat of Tshuva is scheme the halacha, could be that it says in the Tshuva he agreed that the halacha is like Rabbi Yosef. The midvarat bilchot shkatob beokimna. Look above. He says that from his words in the halachot that he wrote, that we qualify the Bet Shammai, aval the Bet Hillel. But according to Bet Hillel, he says, "Let lehu shvilat kelim." They don't really, as we said, right? They don't really hold by the prohibition of letting the utensils rest. The sharet, therefore, it's allowed. V'kaman de'amar asur, and there is one that says it's forbidden. V'afilu lebet Hillel, even according to Bet Hillel, mitneh shem mashmat etakol, because it makes noise. Yesh li achriya. So he says, how do we paskin? The sfira le Rabbi Yosef, that he paskin like Rabbi Yosef. He holds like Rabbi Yosef. Since he wrote like this in the beginning, the idach sevara katab b'lashon ikaman de'amar, and the other one he wrote like yesh omrim, right? Some say. So the rule is, right, when you have stam and yesh, the rule halacha is like the stam. So here also the same thing, right? Because it's yesh omrim ika de'amre, ikaman de'amre. So he says, what's halacha? Bottom line, right? Kiman Sharif ve'Rambam Rabbeinu Tam matirim, since all these rabbis are allowing this, right? They're lenient. Oh, the milta de Rabbananhu, and it's also a rabbinical issue, right? That's how we paskin. But he says in a place where the custom is to be stringent, you shouldn't allow it. He says. Okay, very interesting. So that's the whole. Yosef. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Long story over here. A lot of things over here. So it says like this. Let me just make sure we're doing the right one. The one we did now was hey, okay. Reishnun bet hey. Okay, fine. So let's see Shulchan Aruch hey. Right, we're in the right place. Okay, so it says over here, mutar liftoach mayim legina. You're allowed to open water to go into the garden, right? To irrigate the garden. And it goes all Shabbat, right? As we said, there's no problem because you started before Shabbat. Also, right, another example is you put you put the dressing, right, on the eye. Ava, right? It's like thick dressing על העין, ואף על פי שאסור להניחו בשבת, even though you're not allowed to place it on Shabbat. Yeah, okay, this language is a little bit difficult, but I'll leave it for now. We'll come back to that. So it says to put the incense under the clothing to give them a scent. And it goes all Shabbat like that, right? As we said, same thing. Even if the incense is placed inside a vessel, person is not really obligated to have his vessel resting. And also another example is we put the barley right inside the barrel, and to soak it there. Also, right, we can put those beans right in the press, to have those fruits ooze out their liquid. Also, this we do right before Shabbat starts, and then it goes by itself. So what are we talking about? As we said, right, we're talking about olives and grapes, pressing them. The shemen, and also same thing with the oil. Right? So then, right, the oil or the juice that comes out of them is going to be allowed in a scenario like that. Okay, interesting. So, also, right, when you have the unripe grapes that he threaded them before Shabbat, so whatever liquid comes out of it is allowed afterwards, right, on Shabbat. So, in other words, he already did a lot of the job. He already pureed before Shabbat. So then whatever comes out by itself is allowed. Same idea also, you're allowed to put the wheat inside the mill, a water mill, and here also you're allowed to do that, right? And so, as you see, right, we're not really concerned about we're not concerned about the rest of the utensils. Because as we said, right, according to Bet Hillel, they're not really, concerned about that at all. And so what about the noise? Right, the mill does make noise, right, as we said in the Bet Yosef. So then how is it allowed? So the answer is that since you started it before Shabbat, you're not really making noise on Shabbat. It's going by itself. So therefore, the rabbis didn't decree in this case. Okay, so let's look in the Ramah. So before we go to the Ramah, right, just to mention this, to clarify, all these things are allowed, right? Everything that we just mentioned is allowed. So, regarding what we said, right, about the pressing, right, with those beams down in the press to get the liquid out of the olives, and the grapes. So apparently, right, you're allowed to do that. Even though in the Bet Yosef we did see several opinions about this, but it seems to be allowed. והשמן והיין היוצא מהם מותר. So therefore, the liquid that comes out of it, right, oozes out, you're allowed to use that liquid, whether it's oil or the grape juice, wine. Right, that's it. Okay. So all these things we do allow. So let's go to Rama. Says the Rama, "V'lo chayishinan le'ashmat kol," right? Oh, he just points this out, right? We're not worried about the noise. Shemur rechaim shel ploni tochanet b'Shabbat. That the people are going to say, "Oh, you know that mill of this guy, right, is making a lot of noise on Shabbat." V'yesh osrim b'rechaim. There are some who forbid, right, when it comes to a mill, as we already saw in Bet Yosef. There are other opinions. Tur, Tosfot, Rosh, Samak. A lot of rabbis forbid. So he says, that's a custom. So the Ashkenazim are a little bit more stringent with this, with the mill. But he says, if there's going to be a loss there, you can be lenient, right? That's what he says. Anyway, goes on. במקום פסדה יש להקל, we read this, יש להקל. כמו שנתברר ליל סימן רמ"ז ד'. ומותר להעמיד כלי משקולת שקוראים זייגר בערב שבת. Oh. So another thing he mentions here is that this is like a one of those utensils that they use to weigh with, by sand, right? So you're allowed to put that also, right, on Erev Shabbat. So I think it's like some kind of a primitive clock, that they used to have. I think that's what he's talking about, Zeiger. So even though it makes noise, right, when it tells you the time, in other words, it has like a chime, it gives you the chime on the hour. So, nevertheless, it's allowed. So, because everybody knows, right, that this was placed, the day before. So meaning what? That it's just going automatically by itself. Nobody set this right now on Shabbat. You didn't touch it on Shabbat. It's just going all the way. So it's, their primitive clock that they used to use in the old days.
Would this apply with like a grandfather clock or like a cuckoo clock or something like that too?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
A grandfather clock that chimes or a cuckoo clock that chimes is
Yeah, for sure. It's the same thing, right? Same thing, sure.
I don't know. Are there people who put their clocks into Shabbat?
Also, alarm clock is the same thing, right? You can set your alarm clock before Shabbat and use it, to wake up, whatever. Not really a problem. Some rabbis even allowed to put it out, the alarm clock, to press the button. Some rabbis even allow that. Where does it say that? In Yalkut Yosef, he writes that. Even though he took slack on that, he gets some slack for that, but he was right though. Okay, I won't get into that now. That's an electricity question. Okay, great. Yeah, so if you have a, right, regardless of the electricity, right? If you just have like a, right, your typical, old-fashioned alarm clock, right, with no electricity, so that would be a classic case of what we're saying here. Same thing, right? Okay, great. Let's move on. So that was Hey. So we'll go to Vav. So it says here, right? So this tour, right? I got to read the tour here. So it says like this, the tour. Lo yatzeh achayat v'machato, right? The tailor should not go out with his needle, pen, whatever. It's really a needle. Below alevlar b'kumuso, and also not the right the scribe with his right writing utensil, whatever they call that, right? The feather or whatever it's called. There's another thing, the reed, right? His reed. Okay. Anyway, Ayin Sham, right? Samuk the Erev Shabbat. So you shouldn't go out Erev Shabbat with these utensils, right? These professionals, these craftsmen should not go out. Why is that? Because we're afraid that they're going to carry them, right, on Shabbat with no eruv, right? All that kind of stuff. What are we talking about? When it's close to darkness, So usually that means, right, that it's a half hour before. So why is that? Because he may forget, right, that he has it in his pocket, and he may go outside, right, to carry it. But he says when it comes to tefillin, you're allowed to go out, right, before darkness with the tefillin on. We're not afraid, right? We're not concerned that he's going to forget and carry it outside. Why? Because a person is not allowed to, right, remove his concentration from the tefillin. He always has to be concentrated on it, focused on it. Right, when it's still in his head. So therefore, we're not concerned that he's going to forget.
Is this due to lack of an eruv, or is this from muksa?
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so the truth is, it's because of the eruv, not because of the muktzah. Because the muktzah issue is only rabbinical,
But
the carrying issue is from the Torah.
Okay, but the prohibition on like professionals carrying their their darning equipment or their stylus or whatever, that's because of carrying? That's not because
it's carrying outside.
Thank you.
In the public domain. But if you have an eruv, it's okay, that's for sure.
But if they're
most places in those times, they didn't have an eruv.
Right, but if they're professionals, those are tools of a professional. Don't they become muksa?
Yeah, it's true. But you know what it is? These guys, because they're used to wearing those things all the time, they forget. It's just like something where all their life they're running around with that stuff. So they don't put their mind to it.
I would just mean like even in an eruv, wouldn't these things still be considered muksa?
So let me explain to you, right, how it works. The eruv is the muktzah issue is only rabbinical. So what does that mean? Anything which is muktzah, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbat, even in the house, right? But when it comes to the eruv issue, so there, if you're carrying outside, that's from the Torah, Whether it's muktzah or not, doesn't matter. You're not allowed to carry it outside.
Thank you.
That's the thing. So anyway, so yeah, interesting. So those guys are not supposed to, but the tefillin is okay. Because he has his mind on it, he doesn't divert his mind from it. Mitzvah, I'll call it okay. That's the end of it. Let's go to Bet Yosef. So it says that Yosef, he brings a source for this, right? It's a Mishnah and Perek Kamad b'Shabbat. First Perek of Shabbat, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Aval b'tfilin mutar, but tefillin is not, as we said, right? At Sofa Siman, until the end of the chapter here, the tour, right? Gam Zeh Sham, it's also there. In other words, we got to read the whole tour over here. It's all one package here. So I'll go back to the tour and finish it off. So he says, right, in the next thing in the tour, he writes, Mitzvah kol adam sheimashmesh bebagada be'erev Shabbat. So he says it's a mitzvah, right, before you go out on Shabbat, like before Shabbat comes in, check what's in your pockets, right? Make sure your pockets are empty. Why? Because if you have to go outside, right, you're going to come to desecrate Shabbat. So again, right, we're talking about a place where there's no eruv, but there is an eruv. It's not really such a big deal. Samuch l'chashecha. So what are we talking about? Before darkness, right? Half hour before. There shouldn't be anything there that you're not allowed to go out with on Shabbat. That's what he's saying. That's the end of the Siman and the tour. Okay, so let's go back to Beit Yosef. So he goes on here, continues. We say the Gemara there. Yud Aleph Amud Bet. According to Rava, he says we don't decree Carmelit because of Rishut Rabim. So what does that mean? Rishut Rabim is public domain, and Carmelit means like quasi, right? Not private, not public, in the middle. So we don't decree one because of the other. Mishum dehave gzera gzera, because it will be like a double decree, right? Decree on the top of a decree. We don't do a decree on top of a decree. That's why I told you, right? Since it's rabbinical, we're not going to do another decree on it. It's already a decree as it is. So we're not going to put another decree. So matnitin delo yatsa chayat b'machato. So he says our Mishnah that it says that the tailor should not go out with his needle. It's talking about mitokma. In the Gemara it says it's talking about where he's holding it in his hands. But he says if it's just like stuck into his clothing. So if it's in his clothing, right, it will be forbidden only rabbinically. That's what he's saying, right? If it was like that, because it's an abnormal way of carrying. Shinui, right? So therefore, we're not going to forbid him to go out like in the dark, right before Shabbat like that. That will be also a decree on top of a decree. So that's the general rule, right? We don't make a decree on a decree. So he says our that's only with other people. But he says when it comes to the tailor himself, it's a machloket between these two rabbis, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda, if he goes out on Shabbat, like when it's stuck into his clothing, right, inserted, chayav chatat, he will be liable on that, according to Rabbi Yehuda, right, from the Torah. Rabbi Meir patur, according to Rabbi Meir, he'll be absolved. It's only rabbinical. Rabbi Yehuda asur letzet lechayat be'erev Shabbat. So he says, therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's forbidden to go out, right, the tailor erev Shabbat samuch lechashecha, next to darkness, with his needle, right? Even if it's in his clothing. Because we're afraid he's going to go out like Shabbat on that. Well, Rabbi Meir Shareb, according to Rabbi Meir, will be allowed. Because if not so, Havya will be a decree on top of a decree. Okay, great. B'katav Rabbeinu Yerucham, this rabbi says, B'chelek Aleph, right there, as we said, right? The tailor shouldn't go out with his needle. So it says we're not only talking about these craftsmen. Everyone it also applies to everybody. V'lav dafka biado, and also it's not only in his hand, even if it's inserted in his clothing. This is what the Rif says. Because he only brought the Mishnah, right, in its original form. And then he brought the issue that the tefillin, right, people do remember, so it's not a problem. He didn't bring, right, this statement of Rabbi, the hig gufa gezerah, it's a decree. The let hilchata kevate, because Rahal is not like that. The Rava, like Rava, hilkach lav dafka hayat. So he says, therefore, it's not only a tailor, right, the craftsman. The lav dafka kesheotzi biado. It's not only when he takes it in his hand. Even if it's stuck in his clothing. Ach kasheli, but it says difficult for me. Why? The perek hamotze tefillin, that this perek, right, Eruvin. It's like the Amud Aleph, where it says, right, the person shouldn't stand in the public domain, or in drink, right, or in the private domain. Right, so you know what he's talking about? He's standing in the public domain, but drinking in the private domain. In other words, his glass of water is in the private domain. So he says that the Rif paskins like the Rava, apparently. So it's as if the halacha is like Rava, then it's not forbidden regarding the inserted into the clothing. It's only with a professional. That's the end of it. So he says this wonderment is itself a wonderment. Al Rosh, on the Rosh, Share Katav Ram Kedivya Rif, he passed like the Rif. He wrote like the Rif. Uper Kama the Shabbat, first parak of Shabbat. Uper Kamotze Tefillin, and also this parak, right, Ruvin. Lo pachot velo yoter, not less than anymore. V'efshar lomar, so it's possible to say, Shem poskin Rabbi Yehuda, they pass like Rabbi Yehuda. They say v'machat chova, but a person who goes out with a needle, right, pressed into his clothing, v'vigdo v'shabbat and Shabbat, chayav chatat, he's liable to sin offering. So therefore, close to darkness, right? You're not allowed to go out like that. Insert in your clothing. Matrinti Rabbi Yehuda, and the Mishnah is like Rabbi Yehuda. Katane lo yatzeh chayat, that it says that tailor shouldn't go out. The mashma uman davka, that's only the professional, right? The craftsman, whatever. Aval mi she'eno oman, but somebody who's not a craftsman, yotzeh bat chuva bevigdo, he can go out when it's inserted into his clothing. The ashta ate shapir now comes out good. That they wrote the Mishnah like the original form, natural form, whatever. And we don't make a gezerah and gezerah. Okay, so I guess we'll stop there. We'll finish the chapter next time. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless.